Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The State of Sales Performance, What's Holding Sales Teams Back? I'm Chip St. Clair, Vice President of Content Strategy and Communications at Tyson Group, and I'll be moderating today's session. So drop a note in the chat and let us know where you're joining from as we get things started here. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. First of all registrants will receive a recording of this webinar within the next few days, so stay on the lookout for that. Second, we want to make sure this session is interactive, so submit your questions along using the chat or the Q&A feature, and I'll make sure that we get to as many as possible. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll also share some resources, including a downloadable version of this research report we'll be talking about today. So be sure to stay until the end. In today's session, we're going to share findings from our State of Sales Performance Research, which reveals what actually separates elite sales team from the rest. You'll get to see where execution breaks down most consistently, the three trends we see across client engagements, and what the highest performing sales organizations do differently. Now, I'm excited to introduce our speakers. Joining us today is Victor Bilgin, Tyson Group's Vice President of Diagnostic Solutions. Victor leads our sales team Science Diagnostic, which is the engine behind the research we're sharing today. He brings more than a decade of experience in data science, research design, and organizational network analysis, including his previous role leading the team science division at McChrystal Group. Welcome, Victor.
Thank you.
Also joining us today is Lance Tyson, President and CEO of Tyson Group. Lance leads an award-winning sales training and consulting firm, a three-time Inc. 5000 honoree, and is widely recognized for his expertise in data-driven sales performance. As a #1 Wall Street Journal and USA Today best-selling author and trusted advisor to some of the world's most respected brands, Lance has spent decades helping organizations improve execution, strengthen sales teams, and drive consistent revenue growth. Welcome, Lance, and with that, please take us away.
Hey Chip, thanks. I appreciate the introduction. I had to look up and see who was on camera after that introduction, so I appreciate it. I'm pretty excited today to have Victor on our team here. This has been such a long time coming, and just a little backstory. Victor and I met about two and a half, almost 3 years ago, and as we were recruiting Victor and brought him on, he asked me a few really insightful questions, and one as we start to talk about this concept of sales team science, he goes, "How did you get here? Like, how did you get to a spot where there's a vision for the sales team science?" And I said, Victor, I said, I really feel that so many times with all the different organizations we deal with, whether it's the Dallas Cowboys, whether it's working with private equity and that have a lot of manufacturing facilities, that sales leaders, sales executives, as they're working in this, operating environment, whether it's because of economy, it could be because of a trade embargo, it could be because of a disease like COVID, that they're pressured to really perform, and they have a tendency to treat the symptoms as opposed to what's going on. That usually comes down to, at some level, saying we got to get the sales teams better, whether it's skills, competencies, maybe some process. And I just, as years as I've been in the sales training business, I never have believed that that was always the main problem. I felt it was always other things, right? There was a combination of things that was happening. It's a little bit more complex than just saying, hey, sales teams need to perform better in training. So as we brought Victor on, he really said, there's a way we can measure this and look at sales teams. And I was just so excited, and it's transformed our company as far as I'm concerned. So Victor, I'm excited about what you're going to share today. So
Yeah.
this is great. So as we move this on, Victor and I, as we were talking about this, there's a cycle that sales teams are stuck in. And Victor, I'm going to have you talk about that a little bit as you kind of
Yeah.
introduce yourself and kind of wean your way in here. So,
It's I harken back to the story that you just talked about, right? This has been a really interesting past 3 years of just really diving in this with you and the team and our shared clients that we've been working through. The story feels similar each time. You could see it starts with we didn't hit the numbers, or maybe it was that we did hit our numbers and we don't know why. We're looking for the levers to pull to continue to grow and move forward.
Right.
And uh, a lot of times, what we find is that these organizations will then turn to some easy levers, right? We're going to change our compensation, our goal structure. We'll change our team structure, move people around. And when we do that, who do we move around to the top? It's our best sellers, that now those individuals are going to be our leaders on the team. Um, but as that happens, people who get moved up, they're good at selling. It's a different skill set to actually lead the team. And so some of the areas that were actual root causes remain, and the cycle repeats again year over year. And sometimes even within the year, we're seeing these things change rapidly and constantly. You know,
What's so interesting about what you say there too is because when these high performing salespeople get into management, it's very hard for them to translate their high performance to other people. Sometimes they intuitively do things, they don't even know how to explain it, train, or hold people accountable to it. So I don't know if you even wanted to comment on that as the cycle repeats.
yeah, again, what makes a good seller is different than what makes a good leader. And that transition, a lot of times, is a missed step
Yeah.
that we find when there. And ultimately, as we get to the punchline of a slide like this, uh, what we're finding is that more often than not, people are treating symptoms, and the root causes are usually one or two steps below where those symptoms are occurring. There are things that people need to understand. The levers they pull are can be deeper and more impactful if you take a step back and look at those things.
It's so interesting as Victor started to design this vision, and as we talked, we came up with this concept of how do we look at it? What's that lens? And as Victor and I was talking, I said I think there's seven different elements to like some kind of architecture. It's what the culture is with sales. That's like sales leadership, how we communicate. What does the sales management look like? What's the process for sales management? Hold people accountable. What's the process itself look like, the sales process? What's the methodology? Methodology informs a sales process. Let's look at the talent, which seems to be the biggest thing they go after, these high performing sales teams. And then when you look at enablement, like their tech stack, and then what's the result, the effectiveness, the performance. And so Victor, I'm going to talk a little bit about that lens and that architecture, right? Because the organizations that are looking for the best result, they're organizations that actually measure outputs and but never fix the inputs, like you said, and decision makers deploy training as results. So let's look at the architecture.
For sure. And as you pointed out, this has been a lot of iteration and talking through these things and testing it and really looking at how it's working within larger sales organizations. And ultimately, what we found is that there's there's sort of an equation to what you can look at to drive sales effectiveness and sales outcomes. Um, a lot of times, organizations and leadership will focus on the inputs, specifically sales talent, right? Train my people to be good sellers. But actually, as you look at this, there's there's a lot more to consider when you take into consideration our perspective that sales is a team sport. So we look at it in this way, where you've got your inputs or your people elements, the the way that you set the tone and culture, which we call sales leadership, the way that you manage to goals, the cadence to which you connect with your team, which we see as sales management, and the motivation and talent and capability of your actual sellers, which we look at as sales talent. What we found though, and the reason we look at it this way is that if you just affect that first rung, you still can't effectively predict the outcomes of your team because there's a lot of variability in how the team actually drives their execution, which is why we then will look at key drivers within the team. So sales methodology when we talk about that, and we'll talk about it over the next few slides, really asks, what's the approach, the tactics that your team uses to sell your product or service? Within the sales process, we try to ask, how do you line up your internal sales stages to the buying stages of your customer? And then sales enablement really talks about this idea that you're investing in technology. How well is that technology changing the way that you sell? The big picture here, though, is that none of these things are individual levers. If you say, all right, we need to do better, so we need better data, let's buy a new CRM or improve our reporting, and you focus on sales enablement, but you still haven't really looked at the upstream things around how you would manage that technology, it just becomes another thing that people are focusing on, and it becomes a distraction. So ultimately, that's why we look at this as a flow, that you want to be able to identify where the root is and where you'd want to drive better sales outcomes. And they work together to drive sales effectiveness.
Victor, if you go, if in the audience, if you go back just to the left, you got the people input. That symptom that seems to be in most situations, it's more with the same, it's different. It seems that sales leaders kind of attack that third rung on the people side mostly. They say it's the talent. The talent's the problem. Now that talent could be the problem because of how you hired it. It could be the people you're putting in there. But very rarely we find as an organization that they actually address work with sales management and sales leadership. And it was kind of interesting this year we launched a new program called High Performance Sales Coaching tied to some of our assessments, and for some reason it's taken off because if it's presented the right way, that's actually a big part of that problem because they usually just address the sales talent. Did you want to comment on that or make an observation on that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the previous slides takeaways as well, that it's the easy lever, right? We're
Yeah,
not selling because my salespeople need to upskill, right?
right.
But a lot of times what that overlooks is the complexity of the sales environment, and the complexity of what they are trying to sell, and how that structure would allow for more consistency across your sales reps. Some people are going to hit because they're great. Others will need to have that infrastructure to make sure that if there's, a pitfall on price or other things, that they feel supported and enabled.
Yeah, and our goal as an organization is at some level we believe there's a world where unpredictability doesn't exist in sales, and we're kind of marching to that. Chip, you hopped on. You have a question from Chad.
Yeah, we have a input from chat here that I think would be a good discussion point at this stage. So, one of our attendees said that they're tired of being asked to do and build things that they know only address the symptom, but when they point it out, their leaders, the person in charge, oftentimes feels overwhelmed or confused. Why is it so many leaders are short-sighted instead of seeing sort of the bigger picture?
So, you know, we've had so many of these conversations over the past few years now and talking to senior leadership teams of sales teams, chief research officers, et cetera. And I think a takeaway here is maybe there's a multifaceted perspective. The first is that sales is a really fast-paced environment. Um, we used to talk about this concept, slow is smooth, smooth is fast, where uh, it sounds rudimentary, but a lot of leaders don't actually take the time to plan and think before acting, especially again in a high-paced environment like this, where you're essentially pushing really hard and then reacting to the outcomes. So that first piece is really critical, is the mindset of the sales leader. Sometimes it's they just didn't have put aside the time to think through those things. But more importantly is sort of this idea that so much of what we're finding is people grew up in this system. There's a specific way that this works, and um, there are not a lot of conversations happening right now that sort of try to open the aperture and create a common language for people to better identify the problems that they're going through. So that's really where we've found a lot of these conversations to be really interesting is that I tend not to be in a position of surprising sales leaders on what we're finding. I just give them a sense of this is actually the root. This is the common language you can use when you're trying to focus your efforts and think bigger than just making individuals sell better. Or
Yeah, I think I think that is the root of all this because sales team science looks at the performance of the whole organization. And Victor said something earlier that was important is sales is a team sport at this point. I mean, to get it across the line, and especially a B2B complex sale, that's where we move. Victor, final thoughts as we move this thing on and kind of start to look at the results and the trends that we're seeing. And maybe you could talk a little bit about over the last year, the cohorts that have gone through this, the number of salespeople and leaders also.
yeah, for sure. You know, we've done a lot of this work. Obviously pan industry. There's been a number of industries we've worked in. Um, you know, Obviously there's a lot of trust in the sports and entertainment world, but other organizations have worked through that as well. And we're dealing with, at this point, as we move into the next few slides, thousands of sales reps and sales leaders who we've gone through this process with, which we thought would make this a really interesting conversation that everything you'll see over the next few slides is really data driven. It's not our opinion, it's what we're hearing back from those bigger, larger teams.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I think as we look at those sales performance trends, I mean, we call it down. We have a lot of trends, but for today, we've looked at there's definitely something missing between management and hitting goals and goal team. The second thing is methodology. It's kind of interesting if you write this down, if you're listening, methodology informs your sales process. And what are you going to need how are you going to need to behave in the marketplace to drive the result that the organization needs? And then we've talked about this training, training to perform based off the circumstances at hand. So, do you want to address a couple of these now as we go specifically into the trends?
Yeah, for sure. And for each of these, we'll have some added data points that we can use to really sort of highlight how we came to these conclusions. But these tended to be things that every organization we're going into was facing in some degree, right? And I think it became an interesting part of the discussion because a lot of sales leaders were feeling the symptoms of these things, but hadn't pinpointed the root causes. So the first one that just showed up a lot was around management. Over and over and over again, what we found is that um, people who hit their goals think that the goal setting process is great, but not everybody hits their goals. And sometimes people struggle through that. And what we found is that those that didn't hit their goals, more often than not, it wasn't about whether or not the goals were right, but it was how they were managed to them. And the management systems that we're seeing right now in the sales world haven't evolved with the complexity of the goals. So we'll talk a bit more about that as we get into the first trend. The second thing is as it pertains to sales methodology or a playbook, right? What we found is that some organizations do subscribe to actual named methodologies. But that's less important to us than having a defined way for each salesperson to have a tactic or approach or philosophy to known challenges in the sales process. Whether you're in a different market or you're trying to cross-sell products or you're taking a heavy prospecting and growth perspective. Not everyone is going to have their playbook for that. And if you leave it up to the individual sellers, then that's where this inconsistency and overall team effectiveness lies. And then finally, the sales world is known to experience churn. Not every team has it. In certain organizations, the people are there for 30 years. But generally speaking, whether it's due to we have high expectations, we're always going to churn out our low performers, or there's not a lot of room for growth. So if I need to find my next position, I'm going to go to a different team. The sales world does experience high churn, but the sort of onboarding and training that follows it hasn't matched that. And so the ramp time for people to be effective really is contingent on key influencers and leaders, which puts a lot of pressure on individuals. And so, generally speaking, I'm sure that as listeners kind of see and hear those three things, they likely sound familiar. Like I said, they are trends across all organizations,
Yeah.
and largely that will bring us to the first trend as we dive into it.
Yeah, so this is the first trend, and this I just think this is fascinating. So, Victor, this is I would have never guessed this in a million years when you first showed this. So,
Sure. So, when we run our sales team science diagnostic, we have a battery of, up to 100 questions that we ask to make sure that we really get focused and actionable. Uh, what you're seeing on this slide and in future slides is essentially the aggregate from everyone who's taken the survey. As I mentioned, a pretty large corpus of individuals. And something interesting pops up as we look at sales management. We have a question that basically says, my sales goals are attainable. And what you can find is that a few things as you look at a chart like this. First and foremost, neither leaders nor reps are 100% agreed. But as I mentioned, it doesn't really come down to every organization is setting unrealistic sales goals. Sure, what we find is sometimes you might have a data team that says your forecast should be this, and then sales leaders might override that because they like a higher number. But more often than not, that's not what we're finding. As you can see, sales leaders score 10 percentage points higher than the reps. There's something else that's going on. And what we found is that actually how people are managed to those goals is really a key differentiator. We've found in certain cases that the biggest differentiator ends up being whether or not the reps feel as though they are effectively coached towards those goals, and that on that sort of week to week, month to month cadence, that there's a way for them to retain visibility, voice up, and track the right metrics for them to feel like there's progress to goals. So many of the teams that we're working with, the sales processes they have are sort of long-tailed, complex, and in those complex selling environments, managing to, year-end goals becomes a real challenge. And
got
so
it.
that's what we tend to find that drives some of these differences there.
Yeah, saying you're down by 2 touchdowns, we need to score more is not coaching and helping people reach the goal, right, Victor? Let's
Right.
let's do a deeper dive into this, into the case study that you'd pulled together.
For sure. So we were working with one organization. They had, at the beginning of the year, added complexity to the sales product suite that they want their sellers to sell. They moved from a single product sales motion to a dual product sales motion. And we were brought in at the time, feedback from both leaders and reps was that they were missing goals and they hadn't pinpointed why. So as we went into this assessment, what we found was that the leaders were more often saying that their reps were not good at managing their time. Time allocation was the number one thing they brought up as their biggest concern for their reps. When we talked to the reps mentioned that they were overloaded with too many campaigns to be able to sell to. As we deep dive into, okay, well, how are you managing these individuals? What we found, as you can see in the chart, is that almost 100% of people said that they meet as a sales team once a week or more often. And that was really telling because essentially said it wasn't that they didn't have a cadence to and touch points to talk through these things. It was that cadence wasn't accomplishing the visibility that they needed. And ultimately, the root causes that we found were much more about how they were incentivized in those meetings. A very familiar story that I'm sure everyone has sort of heard is that these sellers were managed towards hustle metrics or these sort of activity-based metrics. And what that did was that actually motivated the sellers to focus on warm inbound opportunities rather than nurturing the more cold leads that could grow into a larger sale. And they didn't have any visibility into the longer term campaign calendar, which would have given them a lot more confidence as far as when their focus should be on one thing or the other. Ultimately, this came down to the leaders themselves saying, we tried power hours, we're trying these touch points, they don't get it. So it wasn't just the way that these reps were acting, but also how the leaders could upskill themselves in managing towards that more complex goal.
The other thing is that meeting as a group with all the work that we're doing, like if you look at that one and the one-on-ones, it's kind of interesting too, as you do a deeper dive and we start to install like an organization, like a sales management rhythm, right? Even if as you go deeper into that first one, what are you talking to them about? Like we're finding that a lot of these, when a leader meets with their team, they're having like five meetings in one meeting as opposed to let's have a pipeline meeting. We're not going to make 10 company announcement, product launches, and talk about a delivery schedule. We're going to talk about pipeline, right? And then how do I get everybody to talk about the pipeline consistently? And we're also finding in the one-on-ones, like you're trying to hold people accountable instead of having a pipeline meeting with the team, they're having individual pipeline meetings, right? There's a certain operating rhythm to drive these results and to get the goal, right? And then, people can't value what they can't compare and contrast. Sometimes a leader, in order to reduce friction, will maybe not share the pipeline or the results their team's getting with the other team members. And there is some level of competition. Sales teams are different than maybe running a project team. There's a level of competition. What's the score? Where am I in the realm of things? I didn't know if you wanted to comment off that, but I know we talked about this before. It just seems like that architecture or that design is just all over the place. There's really no rhyme or rhythm. So if it's not happening at all, or how am I actually doing it? So many opinions out there, and it's so haphazard. Any comments on that, Victor?
Yeah, I think two things. The first and easy thing is that more often than not, I do have leaders, when we talk in one-on-ones or briefs like this, uh, asking whether or not someone has cracked the code on what the right metrics are to track. Um, but I think the more interesting question outside of that, though, is what's the overarching plan for your meeting cadence, right? I think even outside of sales, when you look at executive teams, for example, what we found is that executive teams that, are more effective at running their organizations, what they tend to do is start with their strategy, de define it and operationalize it for their pieces of business, and then map out the pace of change in their environment. Because more often than not, the pace of change for a senior leader is slower than the front line. And
Yes.
so the ability to connect the strategic intent to frontline execution requires a re-engineering of how you try to communicate with each other. And you have to realize that the cadence that you're dealing with needs a smarter plan and structure, right? These key meetings, we need to talk about these topics with these people because their experience is going to be different than mine when I'm sort of in the sort of director seat.
That's
So
right.
it's a complex, but I think really interesting place that people are starting to really investigate.
It is, and it seems right now so many of our clients are asking us to look at what they're doing, and they're open to installing a new way to execute. Because if you think about what Victor said, one, the speed of change or the pace at the execution level, it's you're spending 90% of your time performing and about 10% prepping because you just don't have the time to do it. Keeping the main thing. What are the priorities? What are the goals? Let's keep the folks focused, because at the end of the day, every sales leader we're talking to is trying to do two things: increase revenue and reduce sales cycle time. And in order to do either, it's all about execution. Which let's now like turn it a little bit, Victor, and say let's look at this third trend. And this gets back to The symptom we talked about, it seems like everybody went to say, hey, let's worry about the talent, train the talent. But here's some findings on that piece.
For
Whoops.
sure. So,
Oh no,
uh,
excuse me. I apologize. I apologize. Let's look at the methodology before we look at that. I do apologize. I
yeah,
jumped the gun there.
no,
Sorry, Victor. You can chastise me later, but
you're
most
just
teams don't have
excited
a
for it. I'm
methodology. Well,
excited
I
for
was
it too.
excited to go to that, but most teams don't have a methodology. And I want to make a comment on this. We have been asked so often in the last year. We work with a private equity firm that own a plastics company, and the plastics company had to grow in double digits. Be in this. Think if you're in plastics with the embargo, with oil prices going up, with the economy being all over the place, private equity is saying, hey, you got to grow double digits this year. So we went in, they said, hey, let's look at our methodology because we actually think our approach can't be slow. We got to play like an up tempo offense. Victor mentioned other methodologies before. And if you don't know the difference between a methodology and a process, something you should look into. Methodology is kind of your philosophy on how you sell. And for the audience, so you know that most methodologies have been named by vendors like Tyson Group. So just so you know that, let's take the mystique off it. Like consultative selling was named by a competitor. If you ever heard of challenger selling, right? We have a methodology called the adaptive selling. We believe that you're going to have to adapt your process based off the conditions right now. Relationship selling, value-based selling, they're all different things, but we're finding now that most of our clients believe they suffer from the disease of uniqueness, that they need a methodology for their circumstances. And we're getting called in to design that a little bit. So, but most teams don't actually have a methodology, Victor. Talk about that for a second, our findings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this was actually in the early work with you, one of the areas that had to spend the most time to really sort of hammer home and make sure that I understood the difference between your sales process stages and then the way that you sell within those stages, right? But this ends up being a really critical part of the discussion almost every time that we're doing this type of work. And the most interesting thing that pops up is this. Many organizations are fine with not having that shared methodology because they believe that that allows their sales reps to be authentic to themselves, which is a really sought after characteristic in a selling environment. People really care about
Yes.
selling your own way.
Well said.
The interesting thing is that when we ask people whether or not they understand the sales methodology, reps more often than not will say yes. But if we ask them, do the people across your team execute the sales methodology in the same way? It's one of the lowest scoring items every single time we run these projects. And, there's a distance between saying that and making leaders care about that. Because the initial reaction is usually, right, I want to sell my own way. But what that does is it creates the opportunity for very important inconsistencies. So some reps would likely discount a lot sooner than others. Other reps will say we're selling in a second tier market, and that means that your goals first market sales is not going to happen. Or you're dealing with an organization that says, just show up and be present and be professional, but regardless, for this product, this is how you sell. For this product, this is how you sell. And that makes this really challenging situation if you were ever to move across an organization. You have to basically relearn your job. There's countless examples of where the lack of a playbook creates an opportunity for reps to have an excuse as to why they didn't hit goals this year. And leaders reinforce those things. The interesting thing with all of that, though, is that every single organization we go into, when we ask about, outgoing sales effectiveness, whether or not leaders believe their reps can, do an elevator pitch or manage objections, leaders always score their reps much lower than the reps score themselves. And so this isn't to say that it's not just a skill or your training issue. What we've found is that creating that shared sales strategy, that approach and playbook becomes a massive differentiator in how you close the gap across the inconsistencies in a team.
Oh, really well said. And it amazes me too. You and I we're literally on with a sports executive that runs a team of about 50. And I don't want to name it, but he seemed to even talk about methodology and process as one of the same. And I actually went back and coached him on it, and he goes, "Yeah, I never really thought of it." I said, "It's one of the reasons why your salespeople are all over the board, and you have such extremes from your high performers to your low performers. You don't have a shared philosophy or methodology or approach. That's really what that is." Chip, you have another question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things that just came through Q&A is, do sales teams need to have a sales process and a methodology to be successful?
I'm going to take a stab. Yeah, I think yes. Your sales methodology informs your sales process. Your sales process, your step-by-step way that you're going to drive something to a close. Your methodology is kind of like, think of it like are we running a run and shoot offense? Like what kind of are we running the 46 defense, or are we running a 2-3 trap in hockey? Not to use too many analogies, but that's your philosophy. Is it a dump and chase? Like what is that? Could you operate? Should they? Must they have it? I think Victor said they don't have to. But what is the philosophy? Then you have all these different salespeople going in different directions. So, Victor, you may have a
Yeah.
slight difference in philosophy there, but that's how I would
So
answer it.
I'll give an example. In the sort of partnership marketing or sponsorship space, because I think it's been really interesting to see how teams deal with that differently. In some organizations, what I've found is that there is a heavy subscription to the process. If I said, "What's your calendar look like?" I each person can tell me, in December and January, we're selecting our accounts. Through these months, we're doing these activities. Through these months, we're doing these activities. We expect to close at this point, and then we're working on, the next phase. In other teams, I've asked that question and I've basically gotten shrugs. And so to me, that's a gap in sales process. What is exactly is the way that you move your client through their stages? And do you have a sense of how long that will take? And how do you know you're moving from stage to stage? Right. I think that's an important sort of backbone to the selling
Yeah,
process.
predictable process yields predictable
Right.
results, right? Yeah.
But for the team that some teams where I'm talking about, they have that process. The other thing they'll say is, each person goes through that process their own way. And what I found is that what that creates is, like I said, one of the examples I provided was, hey, we're selling in a second tier market, but you've upped our goals so that we need to hit higher targets. I don't believe I can do that with the groups that are in this second tier market. To me, that's not about sales process. That's about how do you tell your story
Yep.
within that sales process. How do you think about the way that you prospect, the approach you have on those groups, the way that you open up the door, how do you nurture those leads? All of that isn't really about process. It's about the message that you're bringing, the philosophy and tactics that you're using to get there. So that's why I
Agreed.
think those two things are really important, but separate ideas.
Yeah, and if we believe at Tyson Group that taking the unpredictability out of sales can exist without methodology, you're losing a high odds play there to be able to even do that. So, Chip, you had another comment or question?
Yeah, we have another comment here. Would you agree that letting reps sell in their own authentic way is effective only when each rep is really successful in their own unique approaches? Always less likely the more reps on your team.
For these questions around this is kind of interesting. You also have to understand that sales is half art and half science, right? I can't say it's complete science, even though we have a product called Sales Team Science. There is some science, but there is some architecture too, which makes it half art, right? So salespeople are going to have their own personalities, they're going to have their own signature things, and the authenticity is going to come out with their approach. I mean, we have people, we have 6 sellers at Tyson Group. I have one seller that's extremely charismatic. That's just who he is. I have another one just outworks everybody. We have a similar message, right? That's where the authenticity comes out. But if we can't guide that to a magnetic or true north through a methodology, we're not going to get the results we need. Victor, I don't know if you have any other comments there.
Yeah, well said. And I think there was a comment too that said this similarly, the most recent one. Um, Being genuine and authentic to yourself is really important because if you're not in a sales conversation, then your buyer will notice, right?
Yeah,
You
you're
will,
not going to be
right?
believable, right? Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that arming those individuals with a common toolkit is robbing them of their authenticity, right? And I think that's the key differentiator is that it's not like read this script every single time the way that you need to, but hey, I imagine you're going to get this type of objection. Here's a way that you can navigate that objection while remaining authentic to yourself, right? And so that's why we talk a lot about I don't necessarily think you need to subscribe to one single named methodology, but think about methodology as a common playbook that allows for your sellers to have consistency in managing known challenges in your sales process.
Before we get into trend three, as we button this piece up, it is up to the leader to determine what that philosophy is going to be. What's that offense going to look like? What's that defense going to look like? And this and you have it's your responsibility to start crafting that. I wouldn't just buy into these generic like everybody we talk about. One of the methodologies out there is consultative selling. Everybody gets excited about that until you ask them what it means, and then everybody has a different definition of it. So don't get just caught up on an aspirational word of methodology. You got to determine what operating environment, what's the organizational goals, and who do we might have to be a different organization for the next 6 months based off the marketplace. So we might need the methodology to address what's going on in the market too. There's that. So that's up to the leader to kind of determine some of that also. So don't just get caught up on aspirational words with methodology. I think it's important. Let's look at trend three. This is the one I got excited about, Victor. So I kind of tipped my hand on this one. This would actually be the symptom piece, the looking at how we onboard and train people. So let's talk about that and your findings there.
Yeah, what should jump off the page here is that as it pertains to onboarding and training satisfaction and quality, is that consistently leaders are scoring those things worse than reps. And I think the really important consideration that you would have when seeing that is it's probably because those leaders are taking on the burden of training folks and onboarding them because there isn't a systematic way to do that. And what we mean by that is that generally speaking, it's not just what's the system and process that you need to train and onboard. It's also making sure that there is a considered look at how training should be executed when, for what purposes outside of the sort of standard and stock sales skills piece. A lot of times, what we're finding is that organizations are starting to look really hard about their training calendar, not just availability of trainers and this is the year, this is the part of the year we're doing this. It's really about the ongoing experience, about setting up that training, having the right tools, pre-planning about what people need to be effective in their roles, as well as leveraging things like peer-to-peer networks, and leveraging the existing meeting cadence to better surface up things like best practices and SOPs. So it's really removing the idea that training is this singular event that happens within a calendar year and more about how it is a really important piece of the architecture of your team that needs to have as much thought throughout the year that as some of these other things we're talking about.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that because a couple things. One, when we started off, our founding is a training company. And that's how we got to sales team science because I didn't believe that training was the ultimate solution. There was too many times in my career, whether I was with a company called Dale Carnegie Training. We had a couple iterations of Tyson Group, and I go in, I go, man, training's not going to solve this, right? But then when we do go into the training and we talk to the leaders about the training, they know what needs to be done, but I've never seen a consistent methodology even to train or consistent philosophy. We were working with a pretty large company when the onboarding first came on when we were working with a company that a theme park, two massive theme parks that merged, and man, the scores they got in the onboarding was unbelievable. It was so low, and you could kind of see why they leaked so much talent, so it had so much attrition and things like that, and because everybody was doing a different way, so they didn't have a methodology and they didn't have a philosophy to their training. It was, I'd write this down if you're in the in listening to this. Is training to you an event or is it a process? I mean, that's the first thing we determine. And if it's an event, it's something you do each year and you send everybody to like a Tony Robbins seminar. That's not training, right? That's more event driven. So there has to be a philosophy there. Can you talk a minute, Victor, about training quality? That's not just with vendors. That's actually because that's the one that's pretty close to even too, right? Like, so about 50% of people are saying that we don't even think the training we get's of any quality or the result is.
Yeah, I think what we've found is that the feedback we get around that, certainly as people are stepping into their new roles, there's an appreciation for the fundamental skill sets that people are looking for. Um, but as people get more experienced and they get into more complex sales, the idea of training, as you've put, becomes less of this sort of event and more about the culture that you set for continuous learning. And so for a lot of the organizations we went into, we start identifying topics that people are like, I wish that I could learn more about this. How did this person get this bigger sale? And it becomes the not how do I sell, but
Right.
how do I sell what we sell better?
That's
Um,
right.
and I think that transition is really big.
That's really well said. Now, as we bring this bird down for a landing, we'll leave a little bit time for some questions at the end. Let's look at Victor what you would have as key takeaways if you're in the audience if you had to sum this up.
Yeah. So I come back. The first point is similar to what something I said earlier with this that slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Um, when we talk about diagnosis, what we're talking about is again, not bubble up something that you're surprised by. That's not the point. But every leader that we talk to has some visibility into each of the problems that we're looking at. And by creating a process where you get feedback from people on some recurrence, and then you can use that feedback to create an aligning narrative for everybody. It's a really important step because otherwise, what ends up happening is you have individual actors and teams saying that this is our priority and focus, and you're not working together as a leadership team. So it's really important for organizations in whatever shape or fashion to be able to take the time, get feedback from the team, synthesize it into an aligning narrative and story, and agree on this is where we should focus first. And we should also make sure that we're focusing on the root causes and not the symptoms. The second thing is talking about management. I think the simplest message that we would have is you got to find the right behaviors to manage too, and not just the activity, and then integrate that smartly into the management cadence, you know, and some of the ways that we've found people start to do that is not just saying, hey, congratulations, so and so moved this forward, but actually trying to diagnose what was it that moved that opportunity forward? Can we codify that and then use that as a thing that we track towards? The third is building that shared playbook. Um, something didn't mention on the slide when we talked about methodology is that when people disagree to those methodology questions, we have follow-up open-ended questions where we say, why did you disagree to these things? And more often than not, what we've found is that it's not that people are saying that they don't like the methodology, it's that they say there is no methodology. And ultimately, again, this isn't saying go out there and buy yourself one of the branded methodologies. It is to say, take a look at the places you expect there to be challenges in your sales process and build a shared playbook so people have that consistent philosophy around how do we manage through what might be challenges in our sales process. How do we show up similarly enough that we reduce the risk in our sales outcomes? And then finally, with when it comes to training, what we found is really important is that you take an audit of what you're developing too, not just what you're delivering. So what behaviors are we trying to change? How will we know that will change? And how does that fit into our larger sales cycle and process that we're executing for the year or over the next few years? So that's really the takeaways we hope you have on this one. I really liked the discussion and the chat. It's been great. So I'll hand it back over to Lance and Chip.
Absolutely. Chip, any final questions?
Yeah, we have a few in the Q&A and in the comments. So one of the comments, would love your reaction to this. It's my experience that an organization lack of patience gets in the way of onboarding.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think um so an example I think that would resonate with this. Fast growth organizations, organizations that are facing churn. We were working with one of our partners, and they continue to grow. And something that was happening was there was this inconsistency in their onboarding classes. So if there was a big onboarding class that came in, they would get this premier experience. They'd be sent to the best locations. They would get this sort of structured approach. There was a partnership between the sales organization and HR to really make sure that that experience was world class. But because of the pace they were going at, there were plenty of folks that were coming in smaller onboarding classes. And in those cases, it was completely reliant on the leaders to take care of those things. They weren't getting that same approach. And to your point about patience, what we found is that there was this gap, and actually sitting back and saying, what makes those world-class onboarding experiences, and how do we make sure that that's not just as we just talked about, an event that you plan for, but a system that everyone goes through. And so that sitting back and just saying, what makes these things great? What are the things we want to train to, and what are the common experiences that we want to have? A lot of organizations haven't done that work. And so it just becomes very reactionary.
I think it's really well said. I have nothing to add to that, Victor, and I usually do. Well said.
Excellent,
Chip, other
excellent.
questions? Is that the
In the Q&A, we have a few more I think we can get to. It says, my organization has tried multiple sales methodologies and none of them have stuck. What are we missing?
I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. Um, and please, I'm kind of criticizing the industry that we're in. Most of these sales methodologies are an aspirational word. It doesn't mean they're going to be right for you. You got to decide, like, look, we have so many leads that come into our company where people are curious about like consultative selling. And there's a lot of organizations that do consultative selling. We train on that methodology, but doesn't is that what you want your salespeople to be, a trusted advisor? That could be a characteristic where they give advice. That might not be the right methodology. There's a certain methodology to consultative selling. We have a program called Advanced Consultative Selling. It's not right for everybody. It's not. There could be other things there, or it could be pieces. Secondly, some of those methodologies don't line up against your process or the complexity of your. So it's not you just take a methodology, and sometimes these methodologies are just names for a training system too. So it's not a one size fits all. Trust me on that one. We on our staff we've added Dr. Adam Rapp. He's been on a couple of these webinars. He's like the number one sales researcher, academic sales researcher, in top five in the world actually, last standing. And the reason I bring him up is he's working with a pharmaceutical company right now, and they bought into one of these methodologies, and it doesn't work for their medical device division, and we had to go in, and I don't want to call out the competitor. I don't think that's right, but we had to go in and make it work from a tactical standpoint because it was just a great word they fell in love with, and that's why that is the answer. The the right solution to the wrong problem is worse than the wrong solution to the right problem. You can get the problem right at some level. So I hope that answers that question. Chip, do you have any other questions? We bring this down for a landing.
Yeah, we have another one that popped into the Q&A here. Would this be suggested for a senior leader who is in their observation period of a new role, maybe the first 30 to 60 days?
Would we, I would suggest that leader talk to us about sales team science and our lens and our architecture, because that might actually help you get there faster. We just had a senior leader that said to Victor for a major sports organization that several teams said, I should have listened to what you were saying. It would have saved me 6 months. So, Victor, I don't know if you have any other comments. I think I understood the question. So, any
Yeah,
final comments on that?
if the question of this is sort of taking a diagnostic approach, I think absolutely the answer is yes, right? Because I think it's the most efficient way to get the most feedback possible in an organized way. And to Lance's point, I think again, um, it's it's about synthesizing that into like start here. And so for new leaders, it becomes a really helpful tool for sure.
Well said. And I think as we end this, please download our sales performance trend report. You can get that with the first QR code. Secondly, there's a couple people I've noticed that have been to a couple of these webinars and you're in a leadership position. Schedule an appointment with us. Give us a shot to at least talk you through it a little bit. I see a couple of your similar names, and I think you trust us or know us well enough at this point that maybe we can give some guidance or add some flavor to what's going on. So I appreciate it. Thanks, Victor, for your time and being a part of the organization. Chip, well done with the moderating and questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank
All
you.
right, everybody. Well, thanks for joining us. Make sure to download our State of Sales Performance Research Report and schedule a consultation. Be on the lookout for a recorded version of this in your email inbox shortly. Have a great day.
Thanks.
All right. Bye.